by a court, in our view, have not been fully tested. Such claims, perhaps many, may not be valid simply as a matter of operation of California water rights priorities. We believe that water availability analysis can help identify which claims withstand the operation of water rights priorities and which are less likely to yield reliable supplies to their owners. Such insights can help to simplify implementation of the Bay Delta Plan by the State Water Board. It may also assist the Board's deliberation on CVP and State Water Project permit time extension requests and potential water rights changes that would affect the Peripheral Tunnels Project's water claims. Oh, I apologize for this slide, but I'll continue it. In our method, the obverse of the Board's 2010 flow determinations is treated as a diversion cap. Under this cap, water rights priorities are applied during the regulated periods and during other portions of the year where flow determinations would not govern. For other assumptions we employed in this analysis, I refer you to Appendix E of our written testimony. In our method, we have excluded non-consumptive claims for hydropower generation. We focus the analysis on consumptive water rights claims. On the San Joaquin River, this table shows that there are roughly the same amount of riparian and pre-1914 water rights claims as post-1914 claims. Total consumptive claims exceed average unimpaired runoff by a factor of 5.3. In the Trinity and Sacramento River watersheds, riparian and pre-1914 claims represent about 40% of all claims. Total consumptive claims total consumptive claims exceed average unimpaired runoff by a factor of approaching 5.6. On the Trinity itself, that factor is about 6.8 acre-feet of claims per acre-foot of average annual runoff. Our results reveal that there are many water rights claimants whose riparian and pre-1914 water claims ensure they will have reliable water supplies under a public trust protective delta inflow regime. These include the major irrigation and water districts on the tributaries and main stems of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. Our results suggest that on the Trinity, the Bureau of Reclamation also has reliable post-1914 water rights claims, according to our results. Our analysis suggests that the water agencies with much less reliable claims include the Bureau of Reclamation's Shasta, Folsom, New Melones, Friant water rights claims, the California Department of Water Resources Oroville claims on the Feather, Yuba County Water Agency's claims on the Yuba, South Sutter Water District's claims on the Bear, Merced Irrigation's post-1914 claims on the Merced River, and San Francisco's pre-1914 claims on the Tuolumne. Our organizations are well aware that there are many court cases and negotiated agreements that are currently adhered to in the operation of these tributaries. Our analysis highlights the relative strength and reliability of water rights claims under water rights priority system of the state of California. The State Water Board can follow several steps to align water rights, beneficial uses, and proportional flow contributions to the Delta. The first step would be to adopt its 2010 flow determinations and prepare to implement them. Next, the Board should update its declaration of fully appropriated streams. The Board should define and apply the term fully appropriated to mean that all beneficial uses are already served in a stream or river. The declarations authorizing legislation does not limit application of the term simply to water rights appropriations. Third, the board should update Water Rights Decision 1594 and Term 91. And a fourth path is to adjudicate the water rights of the Bay Delta Estuary's watershed. The process of adjudication would vet each water right and allocate maximum flows to each right in a defined watershed. In conclusion, our analysis shows that if the board adopts its 2010 flow determinations as flow objectives, most riparian pre-1914 and a few post-1914 water rights claimants will continue to divert water at their usual points of diversion at amounts to which they are generally accustomed. Their diversions would be reliable and consistent with the public trust the public trust objective of recovering the ecosystems and fish resources of the Bay Delta Estuary. Our analysis also highlights that complying with the California Doctrine would enable the board to confront and address the least reliable water rights claims, most of which were approved by the board's predecessors. Table 3 in our written testimony summarizes these problematic claims. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, board. I get the pleasure of being last on this panel on a long day, so I'll keep it as short as possible. I know everyone promises that, and you can see if I uphold my promise. My name is Peter Vorster. I'm a hydrologist and hydrogeographer for the Bay Institute. I hope some of my 36 years of working in California water can be helpful in what is obviously a very challenging path ahead of you. I'm giving this presentation on behalf of the Bay Institute and Natural Resources Defense Council. Next slide. Our recommendations are obviously outlined in our written testimony, and I just wanted to summarize what they are. I think we've heard quite a bit about the need for models that, and in this case, I'm going to be focusing on water supply models. But water supply models that can evaluate a broad range of water management strategies, ones that are flexible, aren't highly constrained by their highly constrained assumptions. We feel that there are models out there that also can incorporate do a good job with the economic analysis of the multitude of different water management strategies that are available to water users who are faced with changes. This is what we're talking about, are changes that may happen to the way we manage and allocate water. And change is hard to deal with, but that's what we have to deal with. So we want to make sure our models are flexible enough to look at the kinds of changes that may need to happen, including ones from what nature provides through climate change. There is a need, obviously, to look at a lot of the time steps of daily, weekly, and monthly. The water supply models that we have right now are mostly monthly. I think we heard earlier today from folks who advocated, obviously, for a daily model, and sometimes simple daily models can give us a lot of insight. We don't have to have complicated monthly models to evaluate everything, and given some of the implementation issues that we've heard about, obviously a daily or weekly spreadsheet-based model might be totally appropriate. And lastly, we just want to make sure we are, as you're doing your analysis of the unimpaired flow approach, that and you're looking at different percentages, that when it comes to the ecosystem needs and the fish and habitat needs, that those specific flow needs of the particular species are evaluated. We go back to we disaggregate some of the aggregation that occurred in the board's original proposals from 2010. Next slide. So again, I think it's, I won't beat this horse too much, but just we just need models that are flexible, can look at a broad range of water management strategies, and aren't constrained by their assumptions to maximize, for example, in the case of calcium, the deliveries of the Delta projects. And that is not to say that calcium, I don't think calcium should and will be used. Now, in terms of the alternative water management strategies, I think there's a lot of work that's been done by DWR, by different stakeholders in terms of what can be done and actually can be realized. And I don't think what's important is not the particular number. In this case, there's, if you use some of the assumptions made by DWR and CalFed in their various documents, over 6 million acre-feet of new supply can be achieved in 2030. But again, the point is there's lots of water potentially available, and any analysis that is done should be looking at a range of plausible water supplies, either through efficiency or actually getting more out of the existing supplies. Next slide.
Peter, before you go any further, have you used this logic chain, DRERIP, and then the one that the Nature Conservancy talked about, the Delta Ecological Flows tool? Have you used any of these?
Personally, no, because fortunately or unfortunately, my time is spent in the San Joaquin River dealing with the restoration of the San Joaquin River. So the Bay Delta work that the DRERIP and others in logic chain has been developed by my colleague John Rosenfield, working with John Kane, and so I'm familiar with them, but I personally have not used them. But the Bay Institute, working with our colleague organizations, has been very involved in developing the logic chain. So
you see potential in these tools?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I think you probably heard testimony earlier from John Rosenfield about, I'm going to guess, about the logic chain. So I think, yes, the Bay Institute and NRDC endorsed that, and it would help develop that. In terms of, just very quickly, the kinds of alternative water management that we really feel the analysis needs to incorporate, for not just the fact there may be new water, but in case of any efficiency measure, there's lots of co-benefits that I'm sure you're all aware of. And a good example, when DWR was presenting, or the Bureau was presenting their Stanislaus River analysis, if, for example, they did some runs with calcium that looked at perhaps, efficiency, or demand reduction from some of the contractors, one of the, not only would there be water available for either reservoir storage or ecosystem needs, but I would say greater water supply reliability for the contractors. So there's a lot of co-benefits that we need to look at this when we're doing the impact analysis, not just in terms of the water supply, but there's energy and greater control over the timing of use, and obviously improved water quality. With urban water use efficiency, I think, has a lot of co-benefits also. And again, despite the incredible advances that we have made in reducing our water supplies, I think California has made great strides in using water more efficiently in urban areas. There's a lot more potential there, and at a relatively low cost. The capture and use of wet period runoff obviously is going to have to be, next slide, I'm sorry, is obviously going to be part of any kind of analysis, whether it's for conjunctive use, urban stormwater capture. It's obviously being done today, again, much more potential for urban stormwater capture in areas like in Southern California in particular. For reservoir reoperation, that's done in conjunction with expanded floodways. You saw a very good example from American River, so I think you have some very specific example there. And one of the very obvious things that we have to do in California, we have no choice, and I'm very glad the board has, laid down some fairly aggressive targets, relatively aggressive targets or goals, excuse me, and they are goals for recycled water. But I would argue we need a very expansive view of recycled water for both the reuse and reclamation. One that the brackish water desalinization, whether it's in an urban area or in the San Joaquin Valley, I think there's no one recycled water source is going to yield a tremendous amount of water, but all of them together actually I think will be probably the single most biggest new supply of water, whether it's from oil water reclamation or reclaiming agricultural return flows. And now in terms of the models that we know, next slide. In terms of the models that we know have been used and will be used, obviously calcium is front and center. And as I think most of you know, it was designed to evaluate the export capabilities of the federal and state projects. And I would argue it's not the optimal tool to assess the water supply impacts in light of all the different water management strategies that should be evaluated. However, we know it will be used. And so I would argue that we want to make sure that we are using calcium to evaluate the different water management strategies and not have such highly constrained assumptions about demand, for example. But currently most of the calcium runs are highly constrained in terms of the water, the export rules and upstream users. So I just caution you that when you're using calcium output that as input to your economic models, make sure all the assumptions and the constraints are very well documented, very transparent. Next slide. Calcium is the most detailed and widely used model. It is being used to answer questions that it was not developed to use. But that's just the reality. It has a long record of being used. So all I'm suggesting is calcium-3 is very close to being finished, and I would ask the board, again, the board is in a position to not be constrained by what DWR and the Bureau have used. You are kind of have a fresh plate to work with here. So I would suggest that you evaluate whether calcium-3 can be used in your analysis. My understanding, it may be ready to be released by the end of the year if the Bureau makes it a priority for the last bit of calibration. The reason why it should be at least considered is it has a superior representation of the hydrology. It reduces kind of the uncertainty about the accretions and depletions that we heard today that I think Ron Milligan talked about. It really narrows that uncertainty. It doesn't lump everything into that. It's better documented. It interacts with groundwater in a dynamic way. However, it is a new model. And new models are, from what I understand, the results so far are not that much different than calcium-2. That's not the issue. It's just a new model. Always, it may be more difficult to use. And, you have to learn it. So I'm not endorsing calcium-3. I'm asking the board to evaluate whether it's a logical replacement, because I think it does fulfill some of the things that we want to get a handle on, starting with just the basic hydrology. Secondly, calcium can be used in a way that, and has been used in a way that shows that the conflict that we keep hearing about between downstream flow protections, outflow protections in the delta, and upstream storage protections we need for the fish near, for example, winter run. There's this inherent conflict. Well, I think there's been some runs. The state board asked BDCP to look at alternative 8. Those runs, and then the fishery agency CS5 showed that you can have some greater outflows through the delta, and you can do protections upstream. So I would just suggest that you build upon that work, refine them, and really use calcium in a way that really use it, really, and not be so highly constrained. Next slide. Now, in terms of other water supply modeling tools, I'm not endorsing any particular model that's out there right now, but I think we've heard about WEEP, and I think most of you have heard about Calvin. And the reason why I think they should be looked at, especially as a screening tool, and especially to help you look at the economic impacts, is, well, in the case of WEEP, that I think it's easier to evaluate these different water management strategies with WEEP, and also it may be easier to incorporate climate change, and especially in the upper watershed, and for the entire watershed, but especially in the entire watershed. I know Calcium 3 has made some improvements to look at climate change impacts on the valley floor. Calvin is an optimization model, an economic optimization and simulation model. It again will provide some insights for the kinds of response strategies that water users might employ. And again, I think would provide some helpful insights. And the point is I wouldn't take Calvin in its off-the-shelf form right now. Take these models and adopt them for your needs and your questions. Next slide. I think the models that, whether it's calcium or WEEP, should use the unimpaired inflow approach, or approach that mimics the natural hydrologic patterns and volumes. We think, and the board has, endorsed or is at least looking at this in a very serious way, because we think it's the best conceptual approach to aggregate all the different ecosystem, most of the ecosystem flows, not all, but most of the ecosystem flows needs. And as I think John Kane talked about and others, we're not talking about a slavish adherence to a daily unimpaired flow. I don't think anybody's talking about that. It's an approach. It offers a template. It's a guidance. But it actually, in many ways, from an implementation standpoint, it's an approach that allows you to manage adaptively easier in a way that we think actually eliminates some of the tension that we see with water year steps, the big steps between water year classes. Because if you're looking at a percent of unimpaired, you're letting Mother Nature guide you as to how much water there is. So you don't have to worry about, oh, well, is it a dry year or a dry normal year? I would argue that the unimpaired approach gives you, the opportunity to not get hung up on, what water year you're in. Or sometimes we call that a continuous line hydrograph. If the unimpaired approach is used, as I said earlier, we got to make sure that we do some disaggregation of it to see what the underlying flow needs are for the fish and wildlife. When the board took the submittals and developed their public trust flow recommendations, they built it up from the specific recommendations that were made. When you're looking at different percentages of unimpaired flow, we recommend that you look at the disaggregated flow needs to see how they are actually being impacted, whether it's the duration, whether it's the magnitude, whether it's the frequency of particular flow needs of a species. Next. And the last thing I just want to comment on is just in response to a submittal that was made by state water project contractors and San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority. In 1998, the Bay Institute released a report that we call From Sierra to Sea, and it was an attempt in what I would call a community-based effort, where the NGOs and the water users and the government and CalFed, EPA, all realized the need to look at what, on a landscape level, what the ecosystem conditions and flows were pre-development, what the changes were let's get a consensus, let's get agreement on that. Now, what we do about it is where we can have divergent opinions. I think it was a very successful effort, and I can say that a lot of the information that we developed in there, particularly the maps, are still used by many folks. The information that was submitted for Workshop 3 by state water contractors, somehow trying to show that there's this change in the spring outflows, the impact of the project on the spring outflows. I don't think, there's nothing in that submittal that changes the conclusions that, and the data show. We're all using the same data, so it's not like the data they're using is any different than the data we've used in the past and have used in, for example, in our submittals for Workshop 1 and 2. But the point is that the projects have had an extremely significant impact on spring outflows compared to the pre-project period. We have data on that. We have day flow that goes, and other data that goes actually back to the 20s. So we can compare pre-project and post-project outflows. And we have, recent data from the recent decades. And the point is, despite an increase in average runoff in the 20th century into the 21st century, there's been a significant reduction in spring outflows. I think there's nothing that we saw in their submittal that changes that. And in fact, when you look at comparing the decade of the 90s to the 2000s, which what they did in their submittal, they were trying to say that, well, nature is driving a lot of this. And that's true. There was a reduction, if you look at the two 10-year periods, there was a reduced amount of runoff on average in the 2000s. However, the spring outflows reduced far more, over twice as much as the runoff from Mother Nature. Next slide. In other words, the recent the decade of the 2000s showed a greater drop in spring outflows than the Mother Nature actually drop was. I would also note that the last 5 years of the 90s was the wettest 5-year period in the instrumental record that we had. Another thing I think we can all agree upon is that the unimpaired and natural outflow are two different terms, but in terms of the unimpaired runoff that comes into the Central Valley, that is a satisfactory representation of the natural inflow conditions that flowed into the Central Valley. When we're talking about the unimpaired delta outflow is not the same as the natural delta outflow. I don't think there's any disagreement about that because of the land use alterations, but it's important to recognize that if you want to know what Mother Nature is providing you, the unimpaired runoff is a satisfactory representation of that. And when we want to talk about, next slide, and lastly, if we want to talk about natural delta outflow, the SWRCB report addressed that. It was also been addressed by the USGS in some of their groundwater studies. And in SWRCB, we developed a pre-development delta outflow and average annual outflow that was about 50% greater than what it would be today, what the modeled outflow with today's conditions. The variation in these different estimates of natural outflow is primarily due to there's just different estimates of vegetation types and transpiration rates. And I would just say that that kind of exercise is interesting. I personally am I love historic landscape reconstruction. And if I would just say that I'm concerned about some of the assumptions in what I've seen so far. But, we always are, the Bay Institute always stands ready to work collaboratively, work with the community in addressing any questions that the board has in trying to help them come up with the new flow standards, water quality standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Any further questions for this panel? Thank you very much.
I'm open. Yeah, well,
Gentlemen, the clock's ticking.
Good afternoon, Chairman Hopman and board members. My name's Paul Hutton, representing the public water agencies. And thank you for the opportunity to present to you at this late hour today. And in addition to,
Paul, could you get a little closer to the microphone? Maybe my ears are wearing out after listening to so much
I'm sure it's me,
analyzing information, but
if I can get this to work.
you roll it.
Okay, thank you. In addition to making the second presentation today, I'll also be introducing the other speakers. And I want to thank you for accommodating us in allowing our last speaker, Dr. Hilborn, to present tomorrow as he was not able to attend today. And I also want to thank the esteemed Mr. O'Laughlin for allowing us to talk today instead of move over to tomorrow.
Mr. O'Loughlin's one of the most benevolent people that ever comes before us, so I'm sure he will assume you were going to thank him for that. Some days.
Okay, now I'll introduce our first speaker, Mr. Wayne Lifton. He's an aquatic ecologist with Cardno Entrex. He has more than 35 years of experience, and he has designed and supervised a number of adaptive management programs, including 2 in California.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, board members. Today I'm going to speak on adaptive management, and I'm going to try not to repeat what others have said today. What I'll be discussing are a description of adaptive management, considerations in using adaptive management, limitations in the use of adaptive management, and the core elements. What I won't be discussing is an opinion of whether adaptive management should be applied in this particular case. Adaptive management is a systematic science-based approach for improving resource management. It's iterative. We've heard people talking about the spiral, and it basically gives us an opportunity to learn from the outcomes of experimentation and to make management decisions based on those outcomes. The use and appropriateness of an adaptive management process is a decision that should be carefully assessed when it's used. This includes both science and socio-political considerations. And one of the things that we should keep in mind is adaptive management does not replace the need to make decisions, and it doesn't replace good science, and it's not a means of putting off decisions. Another factor is that adaptive management is used for a large number of things and described for a large number of things. And some of those are very broad programs, and some of them are very site-specific restoration programs. And there's a very big qualitative difference in how those programs are constituted and what makes for success in the operation of those programs. In terms of the decision to use adaptive management, a decision for adaptive management use is one that requires a commitment of a lot of resources over a long period of time. Choosing adaptive management is not a choice to make very lightly because of that. And some considerations that need to be taken into account are that we're using adaptive management mainly to deal with data gaps and gaps in our information that are affecting our decision making. And that hopefully through the adaptation of the process and its use, we're going to find those pieces of information and help us improve our decision making and hone our management alternatives and actions to improve things, fill in the data gaps, and reach success in terms of our objectives. Management objectives and actions need to be represented by models, and there are a wide range of types of models that can be used. However, many authors feel that the best way is to use mathematical models.
Could you get a little closer to the mic? Our note taker's having a little trouble. Thanks.
Okay, I'll eat the mic. Adaptive management also requires monitoring, and the monitoring needs to evaluate results and inform the decision making. It's also used as part of the feedback loop. Management actions cannot be irrevocable if you're going to use adaptive management. The whole idea of using adaptive management is to be able to change things in response to results. So an adaptive management program, as you've heard earlier, should be based on clearly enunciated objectives that can be used as the basis for management alternatives and actions, testable hypotheses, and success criteria. That's a really important point. There should be success criteria and what we should consider as exit criteria from the adaptive management program, assuming that you're going to reach a solution at some point. The best available science using sound knowledge of baseline conditions is going to form the comparison basis for your application of adaptive management, and that needs to be available. Individual management actions that are being contemplated should not overlap others. If they do, they're going to confound results or contribute to increased uncertainty in the results of your program. Well-defined models can be used to assess the potential alternatives, can compare them on the basis of predicted benefits, and provide some guidance to monitoring, including what you should monitor and where, and identify whether your success criteria are being met. Monitoring is really critical, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, but it can be a make or break for adaptive management programs. Decision criteria are needed, and any adaptive management program should consist of a formal, structured, peer-reviewed plan that includes the input of affected stakeholders. In the present case, there are a lot of agencies with overlapping responsibilities in resource management. And many of these agencies are taking actions that affect the natural resources in the Bay Delta and the tributaries. There are many monitoring programs in these same areas with different objectives. And in order to structure an adaptive management program, the role and responsibilities of these various parties will need to be taken into account. In fact, an integrated structure of programs would be necessary. Adaptive management is clearly going to require coordination, integration among parties, and integration in the studies and actions taken. The actions taken would probably and most likely affect habitats and biological populations beyond those being targeted. Everything's connected. Adaptive management, modeling, and monitoring would have to consider those other areas and biota. Adaptive management would likely not provide necessary learning and feedback and the real basis for why you do adaptive management if multiple management actions are being taken concurrently affecting the biota and habitats, particularly if there's no means of predicting the effects of those multiple manipulations, or if monitoring isn't sufficiently coordinated to provide feedback on that. all we wind up doing is raising the uncertainty instead of decreasing it, which is the opposite of what we do adaptive management for. What is often called adaptive management is not adaptive management. Trial and error experiments are not adaptive management. The term is frequently misapplied, both in reality, in the gray literature, and in the scientific literature. Frequently in these experiments, monitoring of ecosystem effects is inadequate because it's very time-consuming, expensive, and has to be designed to look at what your program is supposed to be doing. And because of that, many of these programs fail. Walters, in 2007, reviewed more than 100 adaptive management programs and concluded that many of them fail due to three things: lack of resources to carry out the expanded monitoring needed for large-scale experiments, the recognition that there's uncertainty in the outcome of decisions, and that outcome cannot be determined without experimentation, and the lack of leadership in implementation of new and complex management programs. Allen and Gunderson, in their review, identified some additional reasons why programs fail. Lack of stakeholder participation. Experiments are difficult, and sometimes they're not designed well. Sometimes they're expensive to take place. Surprises, unusual results are often ignored or suppressed. There are usually delays of action or avoiding action. This is always a institutional problem. Many times, the learning from the adaptive management program is not used to modify the management actions, the plans, and the objectives, and therefore things fail. Very often, folks avoid risk, and programs fail because those risks aren't taken, whether those are experimentation or use of resources. Lee, in his book in 1993, speaking to the work in the Pacific Northwest, emphasized the need for institutional support over a sufficiently long time scale as a prerequisite for success for any adaptive management program. Lost the slide there. Well, I was going to show you a slide showing the components of adaptive management, very similar to ones you've seen before, but they're all related. I wanted to particularly point out that the learning, doing, and planning pieces are common to every adaptive management program. But also, in that process, stakeholder involvement from all sides is necessary for success. That goals, objectives, hypotheses, and alternatives need to be considered before being implemented. They should be modeled to find out what provides the benefits you're looking for and what we should be monitoring. And then we should implement the alternative that seems to provide success, monitor it, learn from what we've done, evaluate it, and feedback to the various components so that we can improve what we're doing, improve our models, and improve our management actions. In summary, adaptive management itself is not a decision, it's a structured approach. And by going to adaptive management, you're going into a process, and it's not something you're going to put on a shelf. You're going to live with it for quite a while. An adaptive management plan should be structured and formal. It should be well designed, and it should be reviewed, and it should be reviewed by not only peer reviewers but by stakeholders, and buy-in should be gotten. Adaptive management takes substantial resources. It takes substantial time too. And before considering it, one should look at the commitment that's needed. Programs affecting the resources need to be managed, need to be integrated, and they can't be operated piecemeal to do a proper adaptive management program unless you're looking at a very site-specific small piece. And I know that's beyond the board, but it's something that is really needs to be faced in terms of moving forward. Learning derived from adaptive management needs to improve our knowledge. It needs to facilitate actions that are more effective in meeting our objectives. And lastly, adaptive management may not be the right answer if it can't be carried out properly. Thank you.
Hi again, I'm Paul Hutton. I'm with the Metropolitan Water District. I've spent my career working on Bay Delta issues, state water project issues with a focus on modeling and operations. And prior to working with Metropolitan, I was with the Department of Water Resources. And today, I'll be speaking about a model to estimate natural delta outflow. So why model natural delta outflow? I think you've heard several of the other speakers talk about unimpaired flows, natural flows, so I think a model like this hopefully can provide some insights, as was discussed by the invited panel, and some lively debate. One of the main reasons, this is something that has been explored by the SFEI, most recently with their, in the Delta, and then also Peter Forster talked about a report from the Sierra to the Sea. They looked at doing this to gain insights into the natural hydrologic conditions. They acknowledge that a return to natural conditions is not a realistic goal. However, understanding the functions associated with natural flow could help in restoration activities. Now, the second point I want to look at with these models is, and I'll talk about it in the next couple of slides, and this has been discussed at some length today as well, is that unimpaired flow does not provide a reasonable approximation of natural conditions. I talked about that in the first workshop. I'll expand on that a bit in the next couple of slides. Okay, so unimpaired flow, it does have utility, and it's being used by the board in D2CH31-40 as an index of water supply. It's used to define water year types. Through the 8 River Index, it's used as a regulatory trigger, and it can be used in other analyses. But it really is a proxy of the natural flow entering the valley at the rim stations. And Peter Forster did acknowledge that. But if you listen closely to what's being said about unimpaired flow and reading the literature, it's often used as a proxy for natural flows throughout the system, and that's where the error comes in. In fact, there was some discussion today about developing restoration hydrographs based on unimpaired flow. That's using unimpaired flow as a proxy for natural flow. So let me go on to the next couple of slides. So even though there is a consensus that unimpaired flow is not the same as natural flow, one needs to really listen carefully to what the experts are saying. Right here, just as one example, there's a recent publication that referred to unimpaired flow as it's highlighted there, the inflow to the delta that would have occurred in the absence of upstream human activities. So if we're talking about upstream of the rim reservoirs, that's true, but once you get down to the delta, lots of things of human activities have severely affected the flows, the unimpaired flow. Dams have been put in place, levees have been constructed. And in fact, in this publication, a citation was made to another piece of work, and even they were classifying the Bay Delta system using this term virgin mean annual discharge, which they defined as the discharge before any significant direct human manipulation. They were referring to delta outflows, and again, unimpaired delta outflow is not the same as natural delta outflow. So to look at that, we developed an annual model, which we discussed in our submittal to the board, and I'll talk about that. And then also I'll talk about a model that we're developing to look at a monthly scale, so intra-annual variability, and then I'll conclude my talk with some possible next steps. So here's the model. Here's the annual model. It's really a very simple water balance. It's just it's the difference between natural water supply and natural water use. And the natural water supply we're defining as the sum of the rim inflows, which we're assuming to be the same as the unimpaired flow at the rim stations, plus the precipitation in the Central Valley. Now, water use, this gets a bit more complicated. This is going to be, one needs to know what was the vegetation that occurred pre-development, what was the acreage of those different types, and what was the unit water use of each kind, and the unit water use would be the ET or the evapotranspiration. So these two variables, the acreage and the evapotranspiration, I'll talk about a bit more. What we did in our first cut at an annual model at a water budget. For the vegetation, we adopted the work that CSU Chico did, and they went and looked at all the historical documentation on natural vegetation, and they developed what they called a pre-1900 map. Our consultants did some independent confirmation of this work, and we more or less agree with what they came up with. And here's a copy of the map that they had so it shows the Sacramento Basin, the Delta, the San Joaquin Basin, and the different natural vegetations that existed pre-development. Now, evapotranspiration. This is the area where there's, I will admit, so we talk about model limitations. There's a lot of uncertainty in what the evapotranspiration was and is of natural vegetation. So to account for that uncertainty, the water balance that we came up with, we showed a range, a low water use and a high water use range. And essentially, you can break up the estimation types into two different types. One is a field experiment where they go out and actually try to measure the evapotranspiration. And we reviewed the literature on that for the different natural vegetation types. Now, the second estimation method is using a calculation approach, and it uses climate-based variables. And effectively, what that does is it puts the literature really emphasizes the fact that doing field experiments of evapotranspiration is very difficult. So what these calculations do is they bound